Hey everyone, this is an article from Telos, spring 1976. It's titled Korsch's Political Development. It's by a Gian Enrico Rusconi, and it was translated by Lorette Fiocchi and Wayne Heimbach. So here we go. Korsch's Political Development. Writing in the mid-1930s from his London exile to his friend and disciple Paul Partos, Korsch described himself as a, quote, Marxist in a general sense, critical, not bound to dogma, end quote. With only a touch of narcissism, such a definition would have applied to many intellectuals of the time, but in the Marxist Korsch there is an intransigence, a completeness, a sharpness which makes Korsch an upside-down orthodox. Parenthesis, this attitude comes from a life of political, intellectual, and academic isolation, and his, quote, rediscovery in the middle 1960s is responsible for a series of interpretational equivocations that only now can be clarified, end parenthesis. This attitude permitted Korsch not only to, quote, protest when revolutionary theory degenerated into mere ideology, an ideological cover for an actually opportunistic practice, end quote, Korsch, but also to judge the political errors of the working class, parenthesis, both real and presumed, end parenthesis, with utmost severity. In Korsch, the concept of, quote, autonomous proletarian action, end quote, is self-evident. It is defined by the negation of historical errors. When the proletariat acts, the proletariat becomes the constitutive subject of history. The absence or the defeat of this autonomous activity coincides with the formation of the, quote, counter-revolution as a totalizing reality. This is the core of Korsch's political thought, determining the more complex problematic of the relation between economics and politics, not in the abstract, but as the economic and or political action of the working class and its antagonist. Parenthesis, be it capitalism, fascism, or simply counter-revolution, end parenthesis. From this viewpoint, Korsch's critique of Marxism as ideology, his whole theoretical argument must be reevaluated. The following is the beginning of a reinterpretation of Korsch's work which confronts it with the only intrinsic criteria of criticism, its own political intentions. Korsch's specific theoretical contribution to German Marxism is the attempt to find within this ideology that which deals with the needs for action imposed by contemporaneous developments. In fact, in Korsch, the tragic and uninterrupted sequence of errors and defeats of the German labor movement in the first half of the century is translated into a continuous indictment of the absence and inadequacy of its practical politics, parenthesis, or better, of the practice of its party and union agents, end parenthesis, with respect to what should be authentic revolutionary, quote, action. Only afterwards was there an indication of the theoretical inadequacy of traditional Marxism for the labor movement. This is the basic problematic that informs the evolution of Korsch's political thought, from an initial Fabian and social democratic position to a phase of Leninist, quote, orthodoxy following the council experience. Subsequently, Korsch went through a debate within and against the Third International and ended with ultra-left positions which signal his maturity, or at least his irreversible point of arrival. Korsch's political work has documentary importance even for those who do not accept his political positions. As an extremist perspective which consistently filters through the political history of the German and European labor movement of the last half-century, Korsch's political thought provides us the opportunity for historical reconsiderations. Unlike the concept of counter-revolution that surfaces in Korsch beginning around 1923 to 24, parenthesis, i.e. from the first strong censoring of Korsch's political development, end parenthesis, the idea of autonomous proletariat action is present from when Korsch started to pay attention to the pre-war union movements. We have analyzed elsewhere Korsch's theoretical and political analyses of the council movement. Here we will only outline the theoretical and political framework with which he tried to deal with the key experience of 1923, a framework developing during the preceding decade. One second. Footnote. Footnote: for a consideration of this period, see my article La problematica di consigli in Karl Korsch in Annali Feltrinelli. Part of this essay appears in New German Critique 6, fall 1975, as Introduction to Korsch's What is Socialization? End footnote. Where the hell am I? According to Korsch, the spontaneous expansion of proletarian action in the years 1918 to 1919 had its fatal limits in its inability to organize effectively. Thus, Korsch's passage to Leninism came through his search for an efficient political organization. He had never embraced the, quote, pure council concept. He had never shared, quote, spontaneous visions of anarchism. Korsch had, in fact, always kept in mind how much the masses in a modern economy were unprepared for self-management. To Leninism, however, Korsch had initially added a peculiar twist. He saw the theoretical and practical movement through the unorthodox eyes of revolutionary syndicalism. The masses' spontaneous movement for socialization also fell under the influence of syndicalism, a demand for the direct appropriation and management of production which broke from the traditional framework of the, quote, conquest of power, end quote, on which the theoretical and practical orthodoxy of social democracy had stagnated for decades. At the time, Korsch wrote that no, quote, political means in this sense can be substituted in socialism for the proletariat's spontaneous action. It is symptomatic that in 1920, Korsch saw Leninism as capable of reconciling the, quote, economic spontaneity of the masses with, quote, political effectiveness. The centralized organization of the democratic Soviets could reconcile the aspirations of workers' self-management with technical productive necessities. This kind of abstract reference to Leninism and to the Soviets is a long way from any concrete grasp of their difficulties and contradictions. Moreover, in all of Korsch, there does not seem to be a concept of politics that can comprehend the meaning of Leninist choices. The counterposing of, quote, economic action of the masses to, quote, politics constitutes a watered-down and pragmatic conception of politics simply identified with the complexity of legal measures and institutional decisions from above. The concept of, quote, economics also remains ambiguous. On the one hand, it seems to indicate the totality of the social structure, determined in a Marxist manner by the economic system, while, on the other hand, the economic system itself tends to be specifically identified with the conception and constitution of labor, parenthesis, Arbeitsverfassung, end parenthesis, at different times. In the 1922 essay on, quote, labor legislation for factory councils, end quote, Korsch laid out a new labor, quote, constitution that the proletariat had to express and define in the struggle against the bourgeois conception. The proletariat would thus propose a different way of linking politics and economics and would also counterpose this to the formulation proposed by the bourgeoisie and accepted by social democracy. This plan remains even after the disappearance of the desire to strategically use legislation in ideological struggle. In fact, in Korsch's concept of the economy, the idea of objective laws of capitalism, which in part follows from the new socialist economics of transition, coexist with the idea of the necessity on the part of workers to fundamentally control, manage, and change these laws. In this sense, the, quote, economic transformation qualifies the, quote, political substance of workers' action. The, quote, German October brought about a, quote, pause in Korsch's political evolution. The motives and consequences of this defeat, parenthesis, that saw the, quote, workers' governments, end quote, of the SPD-KPD coalition of Saxony and Thuringia forced to resign in the face of army intervention on orders of the President of the Republic, the Social Democrat Ibert, in parentheses, were discussed by Korsch himself in his speech at the Thuringian Provincial Council on the 28th of February, 1924. Korsch's discussion, as recorded in the stenographic reports of the meeting, compares the events and the different treatment meted out in Saxony and in Thuringia, as opposed to Bavaria, where Hitler attempted his coup d'etat. What emerges is the outline of a Bavarian, quote, fascism, in which Hitler and his companions have only a subalternate and contingent role in relation to the plans of, quote, legal authorities. Compared to the National Fascist project of a march on Berlin, the supposed, quote, terrorist acts of the Saxon, quote, proletarian centurions, end quote, parenthesis, mainly composed of social democrats, end parenthesis, were a mere pretext for embarrassing the labor governments of central Germany. This was seen as the first step towards the establishment of a, quote, national fascism headed by the army chief von Zecht. In Korsch's words, it says Dorsch, but I'm presuming that means Korsch. I don't know, maybe there's a Dorsch that I'm not aware of. Anyway, in Korsch's words, we already have the whole theory of fascism as a direct expression of capitalist democracy and of social democracy as the, quote, left wing of fascism. Mixed with these arguments and with significant contradictions, we find the thesis of defending Republican legality, parenthesis, along the line of the March 1922 workers' action against the Kapp Putsch, end parenthesis, when social democracy itself does not want to and does not know how to perform its democratic duty. Korsch continues, quote, I do not deny that the communists have not only pursued the objective of defending democracy against Bavarian fascism, parenthesis, quote, aha, end quote, interrupted Herfurt from the right, quote, but also the creation of the Council Republic, end quote, end parenthesis. Our historical aim is the establishment of the dictatorship of the proletariat, and to the enemy that confronts us, to the fascist attack that counts in the short run on using civil war, we will respond with civil war, violence against violence, end quote. Korsch, Stenographischer Berichte über die Sitzungen des 3 Landtags von Thüringen. Korsch explains that if the communists do not lose the vision of their final objective, it does not mean that they foolishly expect or desire an immediate insurrection like a gunshot, parenthesis, as, however, someone close to Hitler believes, end parenthesis. Communists know that at the present time, the proletariat is under a constant threat and must be permitted to defend itself not only with political and economic means, but also militarily. Between the direct aggression of October 1923 and the new, quote, legal situation in February 1924, parenthesis, when Korsch spoke, end parenthesis, only the form and not the substance of fascism had changed. In fact, only, quote, fascism could save Germany from the total bankruptcy of 1923, parenthesis, occupation of the Ruhr, superinflation, permanent state of siege, end parenthesis. Not Hitler's fascism, but the legal fascism of Ebert and von Zecht, the fascism of the politics of superproduction, of the abolition of the 8-hour workday, the fascism of outlawing the Communist Party and of generalized repression against the revolutionary working class. If things suddenly became better after the repression, this resulted not from the miracle of, quote, democracy, but rather signified that Germany had been placed in the context of fascism and international capitalism cloaked in democratic forms. Ignoring the growing impatience of the provincial council members, in particular of the social democrats who interrupt him with ever-increasing frequency and harshness, Korsch goes on to brutally attack the social democrats themselves, calling them a, quote, fraction of German fascism, end quote. Quote, with the excuse of choosing the lesser evil, the social democrats have supported all the infamies of the fascist dictatorship and have promoted and used them in a criminal way against the proletariat itself, end quote. Korsch. While we cannot linger further on these impious attacks patently endured by Korsch without reconstructing his analysis of the Social Democrats' activities of October-November 1923, an analysis that falls fatally behind that of the events of the November 1918 revolution, it is important to note how precocious Korsch's unremitting condemnation of social democracy was, as well as Korsch's thesis of the total and irreversible fascistification of bourgeois democracy. These ideas were grown on the terrain of experience and prior to the awareness of the more deviant expressions of Nazi totalitarianism. Parenthesis, as, moreover, the denunciation of the counter-revolution in the Soviet Union did not foresee the Stalinist degeneration. End parenthesis. These are political evaluations rooted in the basic mental processes of the author and which filter and rigidly select every possible further experience. For Korsch, fascism and counter-revolution are not politically and sociologically limited and limitable phenomena. They are exact responses to the workers' defeat. Quote, true, fascism is the economic stabilization at the workers' expense, in particular through the abolition of the 8-hour day. The October-November 1923 experience modified the question of workers' autonomy only in the sense that it was no longer seen to move within a political vacuum, parenthesis, as in 1918 to 1919, end parenthesis, but in the presence of capital's counter-offensive. All of this, however, does not change the genesis and nature of workers' action. Concluding his violent reprimand against social democracy in the Thuringian Provincial Council, Korsch made an illuminating declaration, quote, no party, not even the Communist Party, can invent struggles against capital by magic. A party can tear away the obstacles, can do the preparatory work, parenthesis, for example, by destroying the illusions that workers still have about democracy and the character of social democracy, end parenthesis. But the struggles themselves grow out of the economic situation, and in Germany, this must above all appear in the next years, one could say, with natural necessity, end quote. Korsch. If we did not know of Korsch's hostility during these years toward Rosa Luxemburg, we would be tempted to speak of his Luxemburgism, but in reality it is the council heritage that is clearly active. What is interesting is the claim of the, quote, natural necessity of the spontaneous rise of struggles from the, quote, economic situation. We thus have the joining of an objectivist vision of the economy with an expectation of the subjective action of the class, the absence of which brings about the counter-revolution. This direct connection for the time permits the distinction between the revolutionary action and opportunist operation, and eventually facilitates an unpredictable twist, the denunciation of the construction of socialism in the Soviet Union as the restoration of capitalism, and therefore as a counter-revolutionary operation. The theme of workers' action acquires new meaning following the break with the official communist movement. Already on the 1st of May 1927, we read in the opposition journal Kommunistische Politik a significant renewal of the concept of union economic struggle as a moment of the, quote, constitution of the proletariat as a class, end quote. Footnote. The article is titled Die Wiederherstellung des Marxismus in des sogenannten Gewerkschaftsfrage. Published in Kommunistische Politik 2, 1927. And there's a quote that says, quote, the true aim of the economic struggles that guide and always must guide the workers in the defense and in the betterment of their conditions of work and of life within which the existing order of capitalist society does not consist in the more or less positive successes which could or in fact can be obtained, but in the constitution of the proletariat as a class formed with the victories and defeats during and after these struggles, end quote. End footnote. Korsch's renewed interest in union action is not limited to a counterposition of the revolutionary. Korsch's renewed interest in union action is not limited to a counterposition of revolutionary unionism. Parenthesis, e.g., the Deutscher Industrieverband, for whose journal he worked, end parenthesis, to reformist social democratic unions. The analysis of the behavior of unions introduces a more general argument concerning the, quote, dialectical law, end quote, through which the forms of autonomy and development of the productive forces, parenthesis, which were the original meaning of unions, end parenthesis, are transformed in the wake of the productive forces themselves. In the specific case, Korsch focuses on the monopolistic tendencies of the German social democratic unions through the legal obligation of coalition to represent all workers and to make revolutionary unions illegal. With precise arguments, Korsch shows how reformist unions become trapped in a series of formal and substantial contradictions by limiting their actions to the economic field, above all, from organs of struggle, they become part of the apparatus of state repression. What Korsch condemns is the corporativization of the working class. They sacrifice their own autonomy for the illusion of having certain rights legally guaranteed through the state apparatus, parenthesis, forgetting that they obtain them only through struggle, end parenthesis. Korsch saw this not only in Weimar Germany, but also in fascist Italy and Soviet Russia. The oversimplified wipes out this oversimplified, I don't know if that's supposed to say oversimplification. I think this is probably oversimplification. It says this oversimplified. I'm going to say, this oversimplification wipes out any specific determination of the three different contexts and thus destroys any reasonable possibility of comparing them. Such extremism is possible only because the identification of the proletariat as, quote, productive force, end quote, parenthesis, therefore as a constant, objective element of whatever kind of industrial system, end parenthesis, also postulates it, as an autonomous political subject antagonistic to the existing economy. Where the proletariat is present only as an economic element, parenthesis, in liberal capitalism, in fascist capitalism, and in countries with the dictatorship of the Stalinist party, end parenthesis, it is inevitable that counter-revolution dominate on the political level, regardless of the specific form it may take. This is an interesting logical construction which, however, is totally abstract because instead of investigating and analyzing the historically determined reality of the proletariat, it merely postulates it. It is not an accident that Korsch ends up with the abstraction of a, quote, unavoidable historical necessity, whereby a form of, quote, freedom is translated into a, quote, new constriction, quote, new constriction and lack of freedom, end quote. This, quote, dialectic culminates in a contrast between, quote, freedom and the, quote, state. Footnote. See, das Problem Staatseinheit Föderalismus in der Französischen Revolution, published in Archiv für die Geschichte des Sozialismus und der Arbeiterbewegung, 1930. End footnote. In Korsch's writings of this period, parenthesis, 1930, the period of the anti-critique, end parenthesis, the concept of freedom is not the democratic and liberal version. Even when he speaks of freedom of expression for the individual or for the group against the dictatorship of the party, he always means it as a choice for revolutionary radicalism. Quote, freedom is the negation of every anti-revolutionary bond and ultimately of the state itself. Within this perspective, it is clear how Korsch came to see the closing of the circle of counter-revolution against workers' freedom through the various links of the state or of, quote, democratic, quote, fascist, or, quote, Soviet parastate organizations. Here it is useful to briefly consider the, quote, Russian question, which has already played too much of a part in the theoretical and political history of Korsch. In Korsch's Leninist phase, Korsch could not hide from the contradictions in terms of which Russia was debated as it emerged from, quote, war communism. Footnote. In Korsch's review of Lukács's book on Lenin, we have a summary list emphatically presented from a bourgeois viewpoint. Quote, the maintenance by the Bolsheviks of the old structure of the party, of the old, quote, anti-democratic dictatorship of the party, even after their, quote, return to capitalism, affirm adherence to the duty of preparing and organizing the world revolution, while the Russian proletarian state tries to push peace with the imperialist powers and to attract imperialist capitalism in the construction of Russia, the energetic ideological cleaning up and, come on, computer. Scroll, you bitch. Okay. The energetic ideological cleaning up and the organized strengthening of the proletarian party, while at the same time the political economy of the Soviet Republic is anxiously preoccupied with preventing any relaxing in the alliance with the peasants, end quote. Korsch. Georg Lukács, I guess that's I don't know, yeah. I'm not sure when that review is from. Anyway, end footnote. But Korsch saw these as contradictions whose, quote, dialectical solution was already present. Still more forced was the way in which the author, in reviewing Stalin's book on Leninism, confronted the thorny problem of the preeminent role of the Russian communists with respect to Western European communists whom they considered, quote, beginners in Leninism, end quote. This was explosive material that could not long be contained in such fragile verbal compromises. What Korsch had to confront from 1925 on was a, quote, what Korsch had to confront from 1925 on was a constellation of facts, which taken together had an exploding effect. Above all, the so-called German and European economic and social, quote, stabilization, signaling a period of rapid development, was brusquely interrupted by the 1929 crisis, which, for the Soviet state, coincided with the impelling necessity of economically taking off on the basis of an internal political equilibrium, in particular the relation between the working class and the peasantry, which to many no longer appeared to be, quote, socialist. The factional and personality struggle is only one variable in the Russian political framework that was mistakenly elevated, both then and now, to the determining element in decisions that had their basic motivation in the objective dynamics of the new system. The substance of the clash in the Communist International lies in the interpretations and political reactions to this constellation of facts. Korsch emphasized the factional struggle, even though Korsch presented it as the direct manifestation of the clash of objective interests. The winning faction, Bukharin Stalin, was considered to be the voice of the specific interests of the, quote, Russian people, end quote, before being the voice of the national interests of the Soviet state. Looking through Korsch's journal, Kommunistische Politik, we are struck by the fact that, in spite of the frequency of dates, information, and socioeconomic considerations, the center of the discussion is the ideological accusation of, quote, revisionism, quote, opportunism, etc. There is a paradoxical recourse to orthodoxy precisely when there appears to be a concrete opportunity for the historical realization of Marxism. The, quote, Russian question puts Korsch on the spot. Either Korsch must accept the Russian activities as the practice of Marxism in a new context and recognize the absence of the mass action of the proletariat, quote, a clumsy giant unaware of its own strength, end quote, thus endorsing the almost exclusive political role of party and state, or else Korsch must reject and condemn these realities on the basis of an ideological appeal to orthodoxy. This is a contradiction from which Korsch will never free himself. In spite of these shortcomings, Korsch's critical analysis of the idea of, quote, socialism in one country, end quote, or the refusal to see the Soviet state as, quote, the comprehensive totality of the world labor movement, end quote, rather than one of its parts, have lost none of their force, and essays such as the one on the Trotsky question even anticipate his political Jacobinism of the following years. The same cannot be said of Korsch's interpretation of the, quote, stabilization of capitalism in Europe as a, quote, opportunist invention. At first sight, it is incomprehensible how Korsch and others would deny the evidence of an economic and political stabilization of the Weimar Republic from 1924 on, something which Korsch easily admitted years later in his historical retrospective writings, end parentheses. The ultra-left could point to serious structural disequilibria, the high rates of unemployment, the relative weakness and low standard of living of the working class, but this is not what interested Korsch. The logic of the diagnosis moves on a different level. In the catastrophic economic and social world situation, the stabilization was simply a political counteroffensive of capital. Footnote. In fact, the stabilization inaugurated with the Dawes Plan, quote, is only the first step in the search for ways which American and European capitalism and imperialism can try to take themselves out of their crisis and phase of depression by trying to bring about a higher organization of capital. By taking this step with the conquest of new markets and the more intensive exploitation of the old, all of these attempts are conditioned by the always greater exploitation and repression of the proletarian class. Only on the basis of a new defeat and repression of the proletariat can capitalism hope to prolong its life, end quote. Korsch, des Weg des Kommentaren, Plattform des Linken. End footnote. This ultra-political reading sacrifices any specific consideration of economic data for its final political significance, a scheme which sees in the economy the objective necessity of collapse, and in bourgeois politics the mere exercise of coercion and repression does not allow the proletariat to pose and articulate realistic strategy, but only the abstract necessity of revolutionary action. Footnote: Korsch and the, quote, ultra-left, of course, proposed the, quote, revolutionary control of production, end quote, the development of the movement of the unemployed and its connection with the general union struggle, the development of the movement of factory councils and of committees of control. But the vagueness of the proposal was such as to not really make it different from the slogans of official communists or of the left wing of social democracy. End footnote. What is missing is the analysis of the specific development of the capitalist economic apparatus within the framework of liberal democracies in relation to fascism and later the New Deal. Consequently, there is no specific point of reference through which the modern industrial proletariat subjectively constitutes itself. The modern industrial proletariat subjectively constitutes itself. Labor is confronted with an impossible choice: adjust to the capitalist economy, parenthesis, which records as the choice of the social democracy and Stalinism, in parenthesis, or, in the absence of direct actions of workers' self-management, parenthesis, which will partially appear in revolutionary Spain, in parenthesis, became a pure negation of the existing economy and of its state. Quote, whoever takes as a point of reference the means of production, as the means of production presently exist, must logically not only renounce proletarian revolution in favor of capitalist reform, but finally must also capitulate to fascism, end quote. Korsch. The context of this quote, the 1935 criticism of the program of the American Workers' Party, is somewhat more convincing, but the final result is the same. Korsch's political vision in the early 1930s was so unrealistic that Hitler's coming to power and the rapid consolidation of the Nazi dictatorship did not shock Korsch as it did many German Marxists. It is as if all this was, come on, computer, discounted including the persecution that he now underwent. The historical, sociological, and psychological peculiarities of National Socialism were absorbed in the total judgment of fascism as an epochal phenomenon. Korsch nonetheless completed a detailed critical analysis of The New Order of the Construction of Labor, which was published in 1933 by a Dutch group of international communists. Korsch's ultra-left position sought to differentiate itself from the official Communist Party position during the 1930 to 33 period. According to Korsch, the communists fooled themselves about the outcome of Nazism, parenthesis, as the last stage of capitalism to be followed by the proletarian dictatorship, end parenthesis. In much the same way as Marx fooled himself at the time of the Bonapartist counter-revolution in France. Footnote: in State and Counter-Revolution, which I believe is on this channel, I'm not sure, an essay that appeared in Modern Quarterly in 1939, we read, quote, small is the step of Marx's self-deception, parenthesis, and also Guizot and Proudhon, in parenthesis, compared to the great illusions cultivated by the German communists and their Russian patrons after Hitler's taking power in 1933. They saluted the victory of an open and non-falsified fascism over that which they up to then had described as a camouflaged and therefore a more odious form of social fascism, i.e. the political predominance of the Social Democratic Party. They predicted a rapid collapse of the new counter-revolutionary government that would lead to the proletarian revolution. They saluted their own defeat and the defeat of all the progressive tendencies in Germany and in Europe as a, quote, victory of communism, end quote. End quote. Korsch, the state and counter-revolution. End footnote. According to Marx's celebrated words, the, quote, true secret of the Paris Commune consisted in the existence of government of the working class, quote, produced by the class struggle of the producers against the appropriating class, the finally discovered form through which the economic liberation of labor could appear, end quote. In a similar way, all Marxist revolutionaries saw in the council system of revolutionary Russia the continuation of the commune and the realization of socialism. Footnote, all of this is true, states Korsch in Revolutionary Commune, published in Die Action, which is a council communist paper, 1929, only historically. Today, quote, we revolutionary militants of the proletarian class can no longer even subjectively continue to believe, without some verification and change, in the revolutionary significance of the council idea and of the revolutionary character of the council government, whose direct continuation of the political form of the proletarian dictatorship was, quote, discovered by the Paris Communards a half-century ago, end quote. Korsch, end footnote. Confronted with the flagrant contradiction between the name and the reality of the, quote, Soviet Republic, Korsch is not satisfied with mere recriminations about its, quote, betrayal and, quote, degeneration. It is necessary to understand and explain, even by extending to working class organizations and ideas, that historical dialectic whereby every form of the development of productive forces and revolutionary action reverses into chains of openness. Moreover, the commune form was an intervention of the bourgeoisie. Moreover, the commune form was an invention of the bourgeoisie at the dawn of its own revolutionary process. It was a amendment of its constitution as a class. Marx did not expect any miraculous results from the political form of the communal constitution as such, independent of its class content. It is precisely this indetermination of the communal, quote, form that lends itself to changes in class functions. In his second essay on the Commune, Korsch claims that in Marx there was a contradiction between the exaltation of the, quote, finally discovered political form, end quote, of emancipatory workers' action and the indetermination and ambivalence of such a political form. If it is historically unquestionable that only the experience of the Commune convinced Marx of the necessity to destroy rather than simply take over the existing structure of constituted power, parenthesis, as was expressed in 1864 in the, quote, inaugural address to the International Workers' Association, end parenthesis, is also true that Marx, quote, steered away from propagandizing a regime such as the Commune as a political form of the proletarian dictatorship, end quote. Korsch. The, quote, address to the General Council of the International Association, 1871, was not considered an objective, detached evaluation of events, but something written by Marx not only to annex Marxism to the Commune, but also the Commune to Marxism. In polemics against anarchists and federalists, Marx was forced to directly or indirectly stress those central characteristics of the Commune incongruent with its true essence, and to insist on merely formal differences, parenthesis, military, unity of executive and legislative power, recall of functionaries, end parenthesis. Thus a huge confusion was created, not only concerning the correct interpretation of the historical Commune, but also concerning the positions and expectations regarding the, quote, council, state. The mistaken conviction was created that there were, quote, constitutional forms, end quote, which could avoid the repressive character of the state. Korsch also rejected the Leninist thesis that the state, quote, of the majority of the people against their oppressors, end quote, is already the beginning of its own extinction. On this point, Korsch was intransigent. Up until the appearance of a classless society, the transitional state, parenthesis, both the transitional state conquered without radical transformations, according to the reformist illusions, and that state of a new type longed for by the Leninists, end parenthesis, will be distinguished from the bourgeois state only through its class content and concomitant social function, not through its political form. As we read in another contemporary text, quote, as long as the proletarian class needs a state, parenthesis, i.e. for the whole period of revolutionary transition from capitalist society to communist society, in parenthesis, the state of the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat remains in its political form a bourgeois state, end quote. Korsch. To the extent that one is prohibited from any positive prefiguration of the political structure of a future society and is careful to avoid every emphatic affirmation of proletarian creative spontaneity, Korsch could not go beyond the time-bound reflection of the revolutionary political forms of the past. Consequently, bourgeois forms are more or less surreptitiously taken as models even within the socialist ideology of a Marxist matrix. Korsch reached this thesis through two roads. One, distinctly theoretical, is by reflecting on the Marx-Hegel relationship as, quote, transference of categories and concepts of the idealist dialectic, born with the bourgeois revolution, into a theoretical framework that had to respond, however, to originally proletarian criteria. The other was the more precise outline of the individual, quote, Jacobin characteristics in the historical debate between Federalists and Unitarians during and in reference to the French Revolution. If the unitary centralized state is the final result of the struggles of the bourgeois against classes hostile to the bourgeois, then the contrary is false, i.e., that the Federalist principle is automatically the overcoming of the bourgeois state. History teaches us the extent to which the Federalist principle is regressive. It is not an accident that revolutionaries of a Federalist persuasion, like Proudhon, had to give up this prejudice in order to save the contents of the revolution in centralism. Another typical error, of a historicist variety, is that of assuming the type of state ultimately posed as the criteria of evaluating the revolution and its meaning. Korsch, on the contrary, maintained that it was necessary to start from the contradiction between the, quote, revolutionary movement, end quote, and the resulting, quote, factual result, end quote. This is the true contradiction that infests the revolution, not that between, quote, politics and, quote, economics, as even some Marxists insist. Far from being opposed to the Jacobin bourgeois idea of this state, this idea complements it. And, in effect, a large part of French and European socialism has seen itself as the, quote, social and economic complement, end quote, of the 1793 Constitution, almost as if it was merely a matter of extending within the economic and social sphere a democracy already begun on the political level. Marx and Lenin broke with this tradition and proclaimed the need for a, quote, new proletarian state, quote, but the essential difference between this new state of the proletarian dictatorship and the Jacobin bourgeois dictatorship is still in its ends, its functions, its managers, in brief, in its economic and social essence, not at all in any difference in its political form, end quote. Is that Lenin? Come on. No, that's Korsch. I think. I'm not sure. Yet Korsch did not want to provide a version of the proletarian state different from that of Marx and Lenin. He only wanted to warn about its nature. Moreover, the need of destroying the old state had been indicated sufficiently in the development of the great bourgeois revolution by Sieyès, Brissot, Robespierre, Saint-Just, and the nameless leaders of the 1792 Communard insurrection. But there is more. The Marxist conception of the state is, quote, organized and centralized social violence, end quote, used by the bourgeoisie against the proletariat, but also usable by the proletariat in a different sense against its own enemies, presupposes the existence of a state which is, quote, classless in its political form. Here again is Robespierre's Jacobin conception expressed in a famous discourse at the convention, when Robespierre spoke of, quote, an unsheathed dagger that shines in the hands of the assassin as in the hands of the hero of freedom, end quote. Robespierre, Such a state embodies the contradiction of the revolution as such. Unlike in bourgeois doctrine, however, this contradiction does not obtain between a revolutionary and an anti-revolutionary party, or as in traditional Marxist doctrine, between economy and politics. It obtains rather, quote, in the imminent movement of the revolution itself, considered in a conscious, activist, and subjective way, end quote. Korsch. But despite this, Korsch continued to work with these two methods of conceiving the political contradiction, the relation between revolution and counter-revolution, and the relation between politics and economics. In this regard, Korsch's 1935 critique of the American Workers' Party program deserves close scrutiny. Footnote. The American Workers' Party was initiated by the Conference of Progressive Labor Action, which split from the American Federation of Labor in 1929. At the end of 1933, it formed a provisional committee which included intellectuals such as Sidney Hook and James Burnham. In 1934, it came out with a program called Toward an American Revolutionary Labor Movement, Program of the American Workers' Party, end quote. End footnote. Korsch appreciated in the program the refusal to be enchanted by the New Deal, which clearly contains semi-fascist elements, and the rejection of the American concept of politics in favor of a, quote, worker state founded on workers' councils, taken as the democratic instrument for resolving the contradictions of the capitalist system and for moving into the transition to a communist society, end quote. Korsch noted that the economic platform of the American Workers' Party considered the existing crisis, even if provisionally resolvable, to be the beginning of the end of capitalism. But Korsch objected that it lacked a serious analysis of the concept of, quote, planned economy and of its capitalist fascist characteristics, while positively evaluating planning in the USSR and future planning in the, quote, new society. It was symptomatic of the program that instead of being a, quote, revolutionary attack on capital and capital's totality, end quote, it turned out to be a promoter of partial attacks. Although Korsch's critical approach was guided by the usual schematism of negative orthodoxy, Korsch made some interesting points concerning economics. He located the basic problem of the program and the way in which the central contradiction of the capitalist system was condemned. Specifically, it spoke of the contradiction between a, quote, productive apparatus, end quote, that was potentially capable of satisfying the fundamental needs of humanity, and the, quote, system of social relations, end quote, which hindered this satisfaction. For Korsch, this meant a departure from the Marxist contradiction between, quote, productive forces and, quote, productive relations that immediately translated into a contradiction and struggle between the possessing class and the proletariat. By locating the contradiction in, quote, distribution in the hands of bad capitalist management, i.e. by saving, quote, production, the program forgot how much production is absolutely fundamental to capitalist, quote, distribution. It forgot that in the present mode and division of labor, the worker is one with the machine, and the army of unemployed is one of the determining functions of this apparatus. To accept the present mode of production means not only to reject revolution, but also to capitulate to fascism. Only the, quote, strong state, end quote, in fact, was capable of confronting the crisis generated by unregulated market competition and by workers' rebellion. The strong state was capable of defending the capitalist system not only against workers but also against individual capitalists and groups. This was recognized not only by the petty bourgeoisie, even when suffering under fascism, but also by a wide popular strata, both worker and lumpen. Naturally, the dynamic and extension of this potential popular consensus to the counter-revolutionary state did not interest Korsch. Korsch was mainly concerned with indicating the inconsistency of this state because of the existence of the working class, quote, the largest productive force, end quote. Yet this did not provide a sufficiently precise determination for the general denomination of workers in basic industry. Examination of that part of the program dedicated to union activity was the occasion for a renewal of the discussion of the so-called primacy of politics over economics, which Korsch claimed at best had a revolutionary Jacobin twist, (Lenin), and at worst a radical bourgeois twist, parenthesis, social democracy, end parenthesis. The formula with which the American Workers' Party repeated this error in its program involved the subordination of all, quote, mass organizations, end quote, to the political activity of the party, including even unions, whose peculiar character in regard to other organizational forms was not recognized. Footnote: on the new program of the American Workers' Party, see International Council Correspondence, Volume 4, 1935. Or maybe not Volume 4, but 4, 1935. End footnote. Following this logic, the German and European experience became the negative model for the history and destiny of the non-European labor movement. The overcoming and the synthesis of economics and politics, claimed one-sidedly by Leninism and syndicalism, could be realized only in effective revolutionary action. This is the lesson that will be learned some years later in Spain, even if Korsch had to reproach the CNT and the FAI for the opposite error, the under-evaluation of the political moment in the course of revolutionary action. The encounter with the American world began with hopes based, above all, on the development of the exact and social sciences. Unfortunately, it turned out to be sterile even from a political and an academic viewpoint. In a letter from Korsch to his friend Partos, we read, quote, "As far as I am concerned, I have unfortunately been unable to finish anything even in this country. This time the fault lays with my own indolence and my aversion to realistic behavior, characteristics which you know well and are much worse now than when I was in Germany and in the European exile," end quote. Footnote: the letters quoted above are from a selection collected by Michael Buckmiller and Götz Langkau in Jahrbuch Arbeiterbewegung, Theorie und Geschichte, edited by C. Pazzoli. The particular quote here is from a letter dated June 12, 1939, on page 218. The first issue of the Jahrbuch of December 1973 was completely dedicated to Karl Korsch. Bracket, see Douglas Kellner's review in this issue of Telos, end bracket. End footnote. These subtle psychological self-interpretations show only part of Korsch's problems. Much more importantly, his sense of frustration came from a theoretical framework based on a now closed universe of experiences and, moreover, forced to move in a self-critical and depressive spiral. It is not accidental that, in a letter of some weeks later, we find formulated a thesis introducing one of the dominant themes of his American exile. Footnote: naturally, we should not forget that between 1934 and 1938, one of Korsch's central preoccupations was the draft of his book Karl Marx. This is a work sui generis for the, quote, cultivated bourgeois public, end quote, parenthesis, as he wrote to Maddock on the 10th of May, 1935, in parenthesis, also meant to introduce him into the American academic world. On this point, however, Korsch is rather ambivalent. On the one hand, Korsch was not disposed to abandon, for opportunist reasons, any of his, quote, revolutionary, end quote, positions, parenthesis, the refusal to openly criticize Marx, as he was then doing in radical left journals, is a sign of this attitude, end parenthesis. On the other hand, his concern for American social sciences was authentic and corresponded to a deep-seated scientist pragmatic bent. Korsch particularly cultivated relations with his psychologist friend, Kurt Lewin, parenthesis, whom Karl Korsch had known since the 1920s when Lewin had published a piece on socialization in a series edited by Korsch, in parenthesis. The fruit of this collaboration was the report made in 1939 at the Fifth International Congress of the, quote, Unity of Science. Korsch also had frequent contact with members of the Frankfurt School, then in exile, especially with Friedrich Pollock and Max Horkheimer. The contact with Max Horkheimer seemed to have as its aim possible collaboration on a book on the, quote, dialectic, parenthesis, which was to be dialectic of the Enlightenment, end parenthesis. The project was never carried out as planned. Korsch kept contact with other institutions and American universities, but except for brief and salutary collaboration and funding, he was not fully received in the academic world. The fact that he was considered a serious Marxist, parenthesis, something which deep down flattered him, end parenthesis, was one of his academic handicaps. End footnote. We read, quote, "The whole labor movement of the past in all its forms has really only prepared the internal progression of capitalism, brought to a counter-revolutionary form by, quote, fascism, but developed and assured on the world level by all the capitalist systems," end quote. Korsch. History had stopped under the sign of the world counter-revolution, but it is Korsch's own discussion that has stopped. The war against Nazism, far from opening new perspectives, is only, quote, "a further gigantic step toward the falsification of Europe, if not the whole world," end quote. This is a recurrent theme in Korsch's writings of these years. The logical schema of the 1920s is exasperatingly reproduced, including the postulate of antagonistic worker action. Also reproduced were the contradictions, or at least the serious doubts. On the one hand, Korsch was sure that, quote, "the secret of the war," end quote, was its totalization, which would create the premises for the political and social power of the, quote, "workers in uniform and therefore the whole working class," end quote. On the other, however, Korsch recalled that bourgeois wars always ended in counter-revolutionary imperialism, and that therefore the proletarian struggle would have to wait till the end of the war. In a context dedicated to discussing the counter-revolution in the Soviet Union, Korsch did not hesitate to speculate about a pure and simple, quote, "mass insurrection against Stalin," end quote. What is most interesting is how Korsch's reflections on Marx evolved up to the 1950 theses on Marxism without any political perspectives. Here Korsch's letters to Paul Partos was crucial. In a letter dated April 26, 1935 from London, we read that according to Korsch, quote, "Today it is not possible to make positive predictions concerning tomorrow's actions," end quote. Korsch. Naturally, a theoretician can always attempt predictions that have practical relevance, as Sorel did decades earlier. But Sorel could still look at a labor movement, although in decline, and a bourgeois tradition not yet destroyed. In today's situation, especially in the United States, everything depends not on, quote, "the subjective," but on the course of a crisis in the sense of the most vulgar economism. In another letter 4 years later, parenthesis, July 26 to 29th, 1939, in parenthesis, we have a more precise political description, quote, "Here in the U.S., everything is still prehistory, and certainly the prehistory of a great and radical history. There are no points of contact. Here one can do and say wrong and incomprehensible things, if one does not want to be hemmed in and have a very limited part in the labor of Sisyphus against the poisoned action of the Communist Party. But in this way, one can with difficulty avoid provoking the struggle of bourgeois intellectuals against the working class. The same is true for revolutionary union work. If one wants to fight the closed shops or other, quote, fascist elements, end quote, or even only the more strident corruption and the monstrosity of the bureaucracy against the workers themselves, one would inevitably act for the bourgeoisie and capital against the working class, end quote. Korsch. Korsch reiterated the depressing judgment for Europe when Korsch talked about the chances of, quote, workers' resistance, end quote, in Spain at the conclusion of the ill-fated civil war. Quote, "your," bracket, Partos, end bracket, "opinion of better chances for a resistance organization in Spain rather than in Germany or Italy is rather interesting, but I believe that in short time everything will lead only to the repetition of a tragic strangulation. Great revolutionary energy, valor, and the preoccupation of the part of Spanish workers to avoid every error is not enough. It is almost better not to do anything before the relations at the European level are not profoundly changed," end quote. Korsch. Letter of 12th of June, 1939. In a subsequent letter, parenthesis, the one of June 1939, July 1939, in parenthesis, Korsch attempted more general explanation of the workers' failure, parenthesis, quote, I believe that it is possible to single out, quote, the unsuccessful solution of the duties of the revolutionaries, end quote, of the last 20 years, and the fact that they wanted to and had to try a road that represented more than a simple ideal, quote, completion of the Communist Party. The only effective historical contribution in this sense was furnished by the Spanish anarchists, but you know very well how brief and painful that was, end quote. Korsch, July 1939. These historical and political judgments were accompanied in the letter by more general theoretical considerations. In response to some of Partos's statements about, quote, new political forms, end quote, that he saw in the new capitalism, Korsch responded, quote, why just, quote, political? It seems to me that, quote, the economics, end quote, always becomes the main and dominant element of all political forms. The, quote, birth of a conscious, mature, and revolutionary reaction of the working class, end quote, is not part of my image of the future, parenthesis, an image that, naturally, is not clearer nor more complete than yours. Today one has only to choose among three clear but undoubtedly mistaken and old ideas, and a certain confusion of the near future, end quote. Korsch, July 1939. The more pessimistic vision of Korsch, the quote, teacher with respect to Partos, the quote, disciple, did not prevent Korsch from often taking positions in favor of Marxism, of its method and its Weltanschauung, as against Partos's too destructive and negative critique. An earlier letter, parenthesis, November 25th, 1935, in parenthesis, written when Korsch was working on his book, Karl Marx, contains confessions and statements which shed important light on the tempo and mode of development of Korsch's whole thought. Quote, as you know, in my orthodox period, I always claimed that the revolutionary kernel of Marx's economic theory was in its, quote, critique, i.e. within the critical dissolution of bourgeois, quote, political economy. By its nature, ... In my last lessons of winter 32 to 33, I have changed my viewpoint a little. I have shown how modest, if looked at very closely, is the critical contribution as opposed to capital's main economic content, how little developed were the critical points, and how a real critique even of classical economy was traceable only in the first volume of Capital, edited by Marx himself, while the manuscript worked on and edited by Engels and Kautsky, parenthesis, second and third volumes of Capital, Theories of Surplus Value, end parenthesis, show Marx only as a critic of vulgar economics and actually as a faithful disciple and follower of classical economics in the details of money, income, etc. I, however, made Marx's practical and theoretical positions towards politics as the starting point of my distinction, quote, between that which is alive and that which is dead, end quote, in Marxism. There was a connection between the bourgeois character of Marx's politics and the would-be continuation of the critical dissolution of bourgeois economics into a science directly social and therefore into a praxis directly revolutionary, end quote. Korsch. Korsch continues that, approaching proletarian revolutionary theory through the French communists and Proudhon during the 1848-49 events, Marx behaved as a radical democrat, neglecting the, quote, autonomous demands of the working class and workers' organizations, end quote. Korsch. Even in the following years, while accepting Blanquist concepts and slogans, Marx accented the aims of the revolutionary proletariat in an exclusively, quote, political sense. The theoretical twist was, quote, Marx certainly developed the historical critique of the economic categories well, parenthesis, and Sorel went too far when he challenged this, end parenthesis, but Marx proclaimed the, quote, overcoming of economics into a directly social science only in the abstract instead of actually bringing it about. This is apart from some cues, parenthesis, for example, politics, concentrate economics, violence is itself an economic power, end parenthesis, which are often freely cited by Marxists as a tranquilizer of the revolutionary conscience. Cues which show in a rather crude manner the maintenance of the contrast in, quote, normal scientific treatment. Even here, theory corresponds to praxis, political party and, quote, economic struggle of unions integrated into a, quote, totality through the political guidance of the Revolutionary Party. From the point of view of historical characterization, one could say that the radicalization of the political struggle through economics and the indication of the, quote, political character of property are genuinely Jacobin, end quote. Korsch. These two passages are too important. Parenthesis, also for a critical reading of Korsch's Karl Marx, end parenthesis, not to be quoted in full. Through the critique of Marx, we have as a consequence the possible positive contents of Korsch's political perspective, parenthesis, quote, possible, end quote, since we have seen they were far from any actualization, end parenthesis. To the Jacobin matrix of Marx's political position was imputed the premature arrest of the theoretical critique of the economic categories of bourgeois science and, therefore, the failure to develop a, quote, directly social science, end quote, which would have corresponded to a revolutionary social practice in the proletarian sense. The latter was sacrificed by Marx in 1848-49 when everything was taken in a bourgeois revolutionary dynamic that in a Jacobin way subordinated, quote, economic contents and struggle to the, quote, political struggle. Footnote. As Korsch put it in his 1938 essay, Marxism and the Present Task of the Proletarian Class Struggle, published in Living Marxism 4, which was International Council Correspondence, his later name, 1938, quote, from beginning to end, Marx defined his concept of class in terms which were ultimately political, and in acts, if not in words, he subordinated most of the activity developed by the masses in their daily struggle to the activity developed by the political leaders in their own interests. End quote. Korsch. End footnote. But why the sacrifice of workers' autonomy by Marx, who just prior to the revolutionary explosion and given, with the manifesto, the theoretical and political foundation to the new labor movement? Why did Marx renounce a program of proletarian revolution, certainly utopian, for a no less utopian mythology based on bourgeois concepts of, quote, revolutionary democracy, end quote, quote, revolutionary war, end quote, against Russia, etc.? Korsch did not offer any explanation other than the persistent Jacobin heritage that carries on the misunderstanding of the significance and dimensions of the, quote, counter-revolution, following necessarily the workers' defeat. In the 1948 essay entitled Marx's Position in the 1848 European Revolution, we read, quote, the thesis according to which the politics of Bonapartist and Bismarckian counter-revolution are to be seen as a simple continuation of the preceding revolutionary development has met with much agreement in the following period, not only with bourgeois historians, but also with Marxist and other social theoreticians, and certainly not among the worst, end quote. The consequence of this ambiguous position are found in the polemic between Marx and Lassalle, and later between Marx and Liebknecht on the one hand, and Lassalle and Schweitzer on the other. In fact, Lassalle and Schweitzer wanted to come to a tactical alliance with counter-revolutionary power based on the revolutionary possibilities implicit in the counter-revolution. According to Marx, who recognized the progressive character of certain concessions granted by the reaction to the workers against the bourgeoisie, the Workers' Party should not in any way negotiate its own autonomy with the reaction. But, in spite of all the criticisms, Marx remained a positive reference point for Korsch, not only because He was the author of the Manifesto and the enemy of every tactical, quote, conciliation, end quote, of LaSalle, parenthesis, something directly connected to the judgment made about it in the faraway 1922, end parenthesis. But most of all because Marx's economic analysis of capitalism was still valid. While criticizing Marx the politician, in a letter to Partos, Korsch stated that, quote, since the capitalism of today and tomorrow, while very different from what it was at the beginning, is still, quote, capitalism, one can still call the theory and practice of the one movement really anti-capitalist, with all its necessary changes, socialism, communism, Marxism, end quote. Korsch. We are thus once again confronted with orthodoxy versus the economic lessons of Marxism, which plays an ambivalent, if not a contradictory role in Korsch's complex evaluation. From this viewpoint, it is possible to provide a careful interpretation of the 10 Theses of Marxism Today, published in 1950. I believe those are on this channel. By themselves and outside of the context of the development of Korsch's thought, these theses announced a radical relativization of Marxism. In reality, they are an extreme formulation of the previously outlined complex problem. If the theses are seen as the definitive formulation of Korsch's criticism of Marx, many things in his published and yet unpublished writings could not be understood. Parenthesis, for example, a typewritten manuscript of 1952 in which the Leninist concept of, quote, unequal development, end quote, of capitalism was positively evaluated, end parenthesis. Footnote. This manuscript of only a few pages is only one of many preserved by the International Institute of Social History in Amsterdam. These are fragmentary works and of a brief range, parenthesis, except for 30 pages of an essay titled Buch der Abschaffungen, end parenthesis, which testifies more to the tormented stage of Korsch's last reflections than to a real and proper development of his thought. End footnote. Also incomprehensible would be the, quote, dream of Korsch's last years formulated in a letter to Ruth Fischer and repeated to Erich Gerlach in December 1956, quote, I am always taken by my dream to restore theoretically the, quote, ideas of Marx, end quote, apparently destroyed after the conclusion of the Marx-Lenin-Stalin episode, end quote. The, quote, restoration, end quote, of Marxism is not a philosophical but a political problem. Is the recreation of a political theory of revolutionary activity for advanced industrial societies, having as its objective the, quote, planned intervention in the economic structure of all the classes currently excluded, end quote. It is the only way to link up with the heritage of historical Marxism, irreversibly filtered through the experiences of classical Weimar social democracy and Leninism-Stalinism. Korsch criticized the, quote, monopolistic, end quote, pretensions of Marxism as historically codified for interpreting and guiding proletariat action. The latter is historically and politically more comprehensive than historical Marxism, forged as it is by peculiar and unrepeatable experiences. Not without contradiction and paradox, Korsch's attempt consisted in carrying this thesis to extreme consequences, not through an alternative theoretical and political discourse, but by remaining faithful to, quote, Marx's ideas, even if necessary, against Marx himself. There appears to be a footnote that I missed here. Footnote. And that's the end of the essay, but here's the footnote that I missed. Footnote. Quote, a critique absolutely pertinent to the Leninist and above all to the Stalinist concepts cannot really be put forward by Korsch because the most important question touched on here, in which all the difficulties of his thought are concentrated, parenthesis, i.e., the constitution of the objects and of the objectivity of experience, mediated by historical praxis, end parenthesis, was not developed in its formal aspect even by Marx, and therefore cannot be done by Korsch, end quote. This is the central thesis of Knecht's essay titled On the Problem of the Constitution in Korsch, published in Telos 26. Oscar Knecht puts forth an interesting case which, however, does more to develop the problem that Knecht was working on interpreting the extensive theoretical needs of the German New Left, than to provide an adequate criterion for interpreting Korsch. Next, critical contribution revolves around two axes: the problem of the formation of the proletarian experience and the determination of praxis as the totality of production and class struggle, everything from the viewpoint of proletarian subjectivity. Necht readily shows how Korsch's contribution on the proletariat as productive force remains completely within the, quote, already constituted, end quote, i.e., with regard to the analysis of how, in the concrete, the proletariat constitutes itself. Necht, however, did not develop a political analysis except for the recognition of the, quote, constitutive, end quote, value of the organized struggle. His basic preoccupation is that of affirming the existence of a specifically proletarian, quote, experience of, quote, vital proletarian contexts, end quote, and therefore of a science capable of seizing them. But does the proletarian science demanded by Necht, who uncritically postulates the existence of a, quote, proletarian experience, end quote, counterposed to, quote, bourgeois experience, end quote, anticipating on the categorical level that which should be the very nucleus of the investigation, resolve the problem eluded by Korsch? If, quote, the class struggle is only one form of the objective constitution, and not even the preeminent one within commodity production, end quote. If the struggle moves in an objective institutional context, quote, pre-constituted, end quote, by the capitalist mode of production and bourgeois domination anticipating the alternative proposals, what are the theoretical and practical consequences leading beyond Korsch's impasse? At this point, Necht's discussion vacillates. Thus, on the level of strategy and political theory, we find in Necht the same postulation as in Korsch, as the world historical, quote, actuality of, quote, revolution, even if it is not on the agenda. This is a, quote, contradiction to understand and to take to its practical and organizational consequences, end quote. And Korsch, according to Necht, should be useful in this respect. Okay, end footnote. That's the end of the piece. I meant to look up who this author was, so I'm going to do that now, but if you're done listening to me, you're done listening, so I don't know. I found this essay kind of tedious. I don't know if I got much out of it. Maybe you did, but it was kind of like, I don't know, a bit of a slog for me. I mean, Italian Wikipedia says Gian Enrico Rusconi was born in 1938 and is an Italian historian, political scientist, and philosopher. Professor Emeritus of Political Science at the University of Turin, graduated in philosophy. He began as a professor of sociology in 1968 at the Faculty of Sociology at Trento. In 1975, he was called for the same subject to the Faculty of Political Science of the University of Turin, where he then moved to the chair of political science. After a monograph entitled The Critical Theory of Society, he dedicated himself above all to the study of German society and the history of Germany in the 20th century in a continuous comparison with the Italian situation. Between 1980 and 1983, he was one of the animators of the magazine Laboratorio Politico. He was the director of the Italo-German Historical Institute of Trento from 2005 to 2010. In the book Cessiamo di essere una nazione, Gian Enrico Rusconi retraces the Italian and European debate on the nation and its relationship with ethnicity, observing how, from certain points of view, the Italian nation is pluri-ethnic. Editorialist of the daily newspaper La Stampa, he was the visiting professor of the Free University of Berlin. He is married to the sociologist Cialo Seno. The works that it has a list of his works here that I'll read off the list here. The Critical Theory of Society, 1968. Youth and Secularization, 1969, with his wife, Chia Seno. Religious Ideology and Social Conflict, with Alfred Schmidt. The Frankfurt School, Origins and Current Meaning. The Weimar Crisis, Systemic Crisis and Workers' Defeat, published in 1977. Intellectuals in Contemporary Society, 1979. Exchange Threat Decision, Elements of Political Sociology, published in 1984. Risk, 1914. How a War is Decided, 1987. Understanding Germany, A Rationalized Diary on the German Question, published 1990. If We Cease to Be a Nation, published 1993, with Martha C. Nussbaum and Maurizio Viroli. Small Homelands, Big World, published in 1995. Resistance and Post-Fascism, 1995, with Norberto Bobbio and Renzo De Felice. Italians, Friends, Enemies. Clausewitz, the Prussian, The Politics of War and the European Balance, published 1999. Can We Do Without a Civil Religion, published in 1999, with Heinrich August Winkler, The Weimar Legacy, 1999. As If God Did Not Exist, The Lay of the Catholics and Democracy, 2000. Germany, Italy, Europe, From the State of Power to the, quote, Civil Power, 2003. Cephalonia, When the Italians Fight, published 2004. The Gamble of 1915, How Italy Decides Its War, published in 2009. Do Not Abuse God for a Secular Ethic, published in 2007. Berlin, The Reinvention of Germany, 2009. Italy's Entry into the War in 1915, edited by Johannes Hurter and G.E. Rusconi, published in 2010. Cavour and Bismarck, Two Leaders Between Liberalism and Caesarism, published 2011. What Remains of the West, published in 2012. Marlene and Lenny, Seduction, Cinema, and Politics. 1914, Attack on the West, published in 2014. Vulnerable Hegemony, Germany and the Bismarck Syndrome, published in 2016. The Narrative Theology of Pope Francis, published 2017. Where is Germany Going? The Challenge of the New Populist Right, published in 2019. And Living in Insecurity, published in 2020. Okay, so that's the end. Thanks for listening.